Good afternoon or morning for our West Coast folks. Welcome to today's National A-Day Association webinar. The National A-Day Association is a nonprofit with a mission to provide education and guidance for all aspiring current and graduate A-Days. We are also proud to work with all types of small businesses, agencies, large primes, and industry professionals. Before we begin, I'd like to note that this webinar is being recorded and all presentation materials will be posted on our website following. If you'd like to ask a question for our speaker, please use the Q&A option here and we'll dive into that at the end of the session. At this time, I'd like to introduce you to today's speaker, Kevin Plexico with Deltec. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. Thank you, everyone, for joining this afternoon. Very happy to be with you. As Tara mentioned, my name is Kevin Plexico. I'm Senior Vice President of Information Solutions at Deltec. For most of you who are familiar with the GovLand Market Intelligence platform, I manage the research team and product team that brings that market intelligence solution to you if you're a user. What I wanted to share today is just a rapid fire sort of set of takeaways and data on how to think about the market that we're in, the administration transition that's well underway and well into the Trump administration, as I'm sure everybody knows at this point. And then we're going to talk about specifically what we're seeing in terms of small business trends and policy changes that might impact the community as well. And of course, I will be bringing some, latest and greatest breaking news with a lot of things literally breaking by the day in terms of activity from both Congress and the court system and Merit Systems Protection Board, et cetera, in terms of how it's affecting the environment on a day-to-day basis and how to think about some of those things. We will take Q&A at the end. There's no reason for you to wait until the end to ask questions, though. So if you have a question, feel free to go ahead and post it in the Q&A window. And that way, when we get to the end of the session today, we'll have questions posted up. Again, we only have a half hour, so it's going to be a little bit of a breakneck pace, but we'll go ahead and jump in. I wanted to start with what we've identified as the top trends to watch for 2025. Obviously, the new administration, the Trump administration, is going to touch a little bit of all of these. I'm going to start with the budget and spending environment and the economic environment and talk about that from the point of view of what to expect in terms of funding. We obviously are in an environment that we're under a continuing resolution that carries us through, I think, midway through March. So Congress has got some work to do between now and then to figure out appropriations. And there is sort of a looming threat of a shutdown related to this that we'll talk a little bit about as well. I wanted to spend some time talking about small business policy, acquisition reform, compliance, cybersecurity. There's a lot going on in terms of policy shifts and changes, some of it specifically related to the administration change, and some of it, frankly, unrelated to the administration change. But we'll talk, for example, about cybersecurity. I think for those of you who are around this industry under the prior Trump administration, you'll remember that CMMC was actually born under the first Trump administration. So I think while we talk about the new administration ushering in an era of deregulation and cutting regulations, I think CMMC is here to stay. And with the reappointment of the former leader of the CMMC initiative under the Trump administration coming back into her role, I think we're going to see the CMMC policies take root. Also, we're going to talk about some of the acquisition changes that are shaping the market and contract consolidation and how that's affecting competition. And then we'll talk a little bit about what to expect in terms of the new administration. And the new SBA administrator just issued, I think it was this week, their day one list of priorities. And I think it's relatively good news considering where many may have come from in terms of fears of how the new administration, with its sort of anti-DEI emphasis, was going to think about the small disadvantaged business program. And I'll cut to the chase there, and that the administration has basically restored the goals for agency to the statutory limits of 5% versus the aspirational goals that the Biden administration had set of 15%. I think the silver lining there is that there wasn't at least at this point, any emphasis or efforts to unwrap the small disadvantaged business and 8A program entirely. I think that was what some people had feared. So a lot going on. We're going to jump into specifically the spending environment. I thought I would start with just a little bit of a level set of where we've come from in terms of contract spending. So as you think about market opportunity and market activity, I think this tells a story of the last 10 years or so. You can look at the civilian side, pretty steady Eddie. You'll see that spike in the 2020 timeframe. That will obviously be driven primarily by the nation's response and the government response to COVID, both from a healthcare crisis as well as from an economic crisis. And that's where we see that big spike in spending on civilian side, and then it's been steady Eddie since then. On the defense side, much more fluctuation, but in recent years, been steadily increasing. Some of this also includes spending with foreign aid to foreign governments that are fighting wars in Israel and Ukraine, obviously. So you'll see that has been driving some expenses in terms of foreign military sales. And then this last year, we had a little bit of a drop back on the defense side. But the one thing I would say is usually we see a 90-day delay in when the administration reports defense contract spending. So I do think there's likely going to be some additional reporting that takes place that closes that gap. So I would really think of 2024 as probably a relatively flat year versus 23. If you compare small business contracting versus other than small business contracting, you can also see the remarkably stable spend on small business and the growth that we see there. So the environment under both the Biden administration and the Trump administration has been pretty favorable overall to small businesses, at least in terms of dollars spent. We're going to talk about a separate issue, which is the number of unique primes that are interacting and engaging within the market. But at least in terms of dollars spent, we are seeing stability and continued growth in spend under both administrations in recent years with small businesses. All the fluctuation seems to be in that other category, and that's largely due to the fluctuation we see in aerospace defense spend. One of the things we wanted to look at was sort of where are we year to date? And for this slide, we have it through January. So that we're just in this case, just looking at civilian spending. As I mentioned, defense spending is withheld for a quarter. So for the first part of the fiscal year, we really don't have solid data from the DOD. And I wanted to pull civilian spending, which tends to be much more real time. You'll notice that 2025, where we've had continuing resolution after continuing resolution and are still operating under a CR, there's been a relatively slow growth or uptick in spend for 25 versus prior 24. I expect this is going to rebound. I do think we're ultimately going to get appropriations that are going to tie off to the bipartisan budget agreement. This was laid out and spelled out in the House blueprint that passed yesterday. That's the assumption and expectation that House Republicans are operating under for 2025, and that would be basically relatively flat discretionary spending for 25 versus 24, with about 3% growth in defense spending. At the same time, that bipartisan budget agreement did not anticipate sort of future expenses and costs for supplemental war effort spending. And the budget blueprint that was released yesterday would call for additional funding for the Defense Department and for border security. So there's, I think, a strong likelihood of significant growth. By significant, I would say 4 or 5% growth on defense, with reductions on the civilian agency, or at least flat on civilian agency. And then on the far right, you can see some of the agencies that are sort of the biggest laggards in terms of spend year to date. State Department, USDA, HHS lagging quite a bit versus 24. So I think we're going to see a strong fiscal Q4 no matter what happens. When appropriations do get done, agencies will have the certainty they need on their funding levels, and I think we'll rapidly be accelerating their spending from the time those appropriations get done, whenever that might be, to the end of the fiscal year. There's a number of issues at play that I think we need to be watching. Obviously, we just talked about the disposition of the fiscal year 2025 budget. with that continuing resolution operating through mid-March. I do think there's a growing fear and concern about the possibility of a government shutdown. Democrats are looking to use the shutdown as leverage to try to rein in the Trump administration's, we'll just say, latitude that they're taking in terms of adjusting spend that's been appropriated. At the same time, I think a shutdown potentially plays into the hands of the Trump administration by allowing them to plow ahead with what they call essential spending, which would be areas like defense and border security, and shut down areas that have been really the target of the DOGE agency anyway. So I think there's a growing threat or concern about a shutdown, and that shutdown could be prolonged. But at the end of the day, I think we're going to end up with appropriations that tie off to that bipartisan budget agreement that passed back in 2023. Other issues at play: the debt ceiling needs to be resolved. There's a new initiative to roll out the Trump administration sort of legislative priorities. This would be extending the tax cuts that were passed during the prior Trump administration. There's a number of deficit actions that are being discussed and that were folded into that House budget resolution, at least blueprint, that passed yesterday, that called for about $2 trillion in deficit reductions or cost cutting. That was largely aimed at mandatory spending. So the Congress would have some work to do to find out where they can find cuts in mandatory spending. For the most part, from a contracting point of view, mandatory spending has low contractor addressability, meaning there's not much contractor work that gets tied into to mandatory spend. And we'll have to see what happens with this discretionary spend. At this point, yesterday, the House passed their budget blueprint. It was a very different version than what the Senate passed. So there's a reconciliation process that needs to happen between the House and the Senate. And I think the success that the House had passing that full suite of legislative proposals from the Trump administration probably spells good news for the Republican Party in terms of being more increasingly successful in getting through the full legislative policies that the administration's calling for. But still a long way to go there. I did want to mention, just to anchor everybody's thinking in terms of the administration transition and the time it takes to sort of appoint leadership, have that leadership formulate policy, and have that policy come out in the form of actions within the agency at their level that most contractors are engaging with their agency customers is through the career leadership. Obviously, we had the presidential election, we had Inauguration Day, and the administration has most of its cabinet in place. There's still, I think, 3 or 4 cabinet positions that are awaiting Senate confirmation. And then beyond that, there's obviously hundreds of appointees that are at the sub-agency level that still remain to be put in place. For example, the new chief information officer for the federal government, I think, was appointed about 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago. So very much still formulating IT policy, though clearly the DOGE organization has called for software modernization to be a key focus of their efforts. So look for that to be in lockstep with the administration and the IT policies of the new CIO. We have yet to see an appointment of an Office of Federal Procurement Policy. So I think acquisition reforms and how the acquisition regulations are adjusted, potentially deregulated by the new administration has yet to emerge. And then I believe it was just the other day that the new SBA administrator rolled out their day one list of priorities, of which one of them is looking at rule changes to simplify small business rules and policies, and the other was to restore the statutory caps for small disadvantaged business contracting. Those are the two that sort of jumped off the page at me as having the most impact on the contracting community and certainly this audience. So just keep in mind, a lot of the policy initiatives that the administration is going to be pushing through still have a ways to go, just because they're still looking to find leadership and appoint leadership for many of the positions in some of these agencies that would really drive that policy change. All right, so let's talk specifically about the DOGE. I know prior to the administration transition, there was a lot of discussion about setting up this new organization, the Department of Government Efficiency, and there was sort of an assertion that the government couldn't set this up because it needed to be approved or enacted by Congress. The administration navigated around that issue by renaming essentially an organization called the U.S. Digital Service to the U.S. DOGE Service. So it changed the mission of an existing agency that was actually ironically set up under the Obama administration, and has sort of expanded their role to be this cost cutting and sort of organization for finding waste, fraud, abuse, cost savings, as well as obviously reductions in force that we're seeing across government. I think early on we are seeing an effort by them to ferret out waste, fraud, and abuse. We're also seeing them reprioritize areas of policy around foreign aid, defense policies being reformulated. We're expecting continued announcements of layoffs that are going to be sorely challenged in courts and by the union. So there's, I think, a lot of uncertainty about the outcomes of these initiatives that are taking place by the DOGE organization. I think the advice I would have for the contracting community is, with respect to your contracts, make sure your contracts are in a good place, that your customers are well informed about your progress and the state of those contracts, and that it's clearly and easily identifiable the benefits that your contracts are bringing to government. And obviously, hopefully your contracts are in line with the new administration's priorities, so you don't find yourself in the crosshairs of a cost-cutting initiative. One of the things that, in terms of an area, I know a lot of you are from the IT and professional services industry. IT modernization, in particular software modernization, was called out specifically as a priority for the DOGE organization. So we do expect that to be in lockstep with the new CIO's policies in terms of driving software modernization across government agencies. So I think there's definitely some opportunities for companies, while there's risks for those of you who may have contracts that are in some of the high-risk target areas that the administration is trying to cut costs. There's also, I think, opportunity areas around IT modernization and investment in areas like border security, support for immigration and related activities, and some of the defense priorities that have been called out the administration that have a lot of technology and professional services opportunities related to them as well. One of the areas that we've heard a lot about is the DOGE organization's efforts to trim the federal workforce. I don't have to remind you about some of the actions that have been taking place, first on offering people an out, basically allowing people to resign and keep their pay through September. That was challenged in court and ultimately upheld. So that's moved forward. I think there's remaining challenges to that, but in the meantime, it's progressing, and you've probably seen on Facebook or some of the social media some posts by some of the employees who have taken advantage of that. I've seen a number of announcements from some colleagues or friends that I know in the GSA that have taken part in that offering. We are also seeing recently a move to trim people who are in their probationary period with the government. That has recently been challenged in the Merit Systems Protection Board. The breaking news this week is that the Merit Systems Protection Board basically required that 6 employees from 6 different agencies have their positions restored and upheld for 45 days. And there's, I think, a increasing possibility and maybe even likelihood that you're going to see that same restoration en masse for a lot of employees from agencies that have trimmed their probationary employees. I think it's looking increasingly likely that we're going to see essentially a rehiring of a lot of those people, at least on an interim basis, while this gets navigated in court. So a lot of chaos around the reduction in force. And if you want to read more about that, I would encourage you to just search on some of the recent articles on the Merit Systems Protection Board and the ruling that they had just this week to restore those 6 employees to their roles for a 45-day period of time. All right, we're going to shift gears to small business contracting and some policy changes here. Some of these are related to the administration transition. Some are unrelated. I'll start with the one that's specifically related, and we talked about this already. With the new administration coming in and unraveling the DEI initiatives that were put in place by the Biden administration, and in some cases, DEI initiatives that have been put in place for decades, and essentially asking contractors to dismantle their DEI programs as well. You are seeing many large businesses. I've seen Booz Allen, some of the other large contracting organizations that have essentially been dismantling their DEI programs in compliance with the executive order. There was also an increasing concern about how this might affect the 8A program, and was small disadvantaged business contracting going to become a target. I think what we've seen so far, and as I mentioned, the SBA administrator's announcement was not to sort of dismantle the program, but to restore it to its statutory targets of 5%. So if you go online to the SBA and look at the agency targets that they've set for small disadvantaged business contracting, you will note that every agency now has a 5% target. This is very different than what we've seen in the past, where the SBA gave specific goals to specific agencies based on sort of their historic run rate of small disadvantaged business contracting. They typically had civilian agencies with much higher goals than 5%. And now that's been reset for every agency to this 5% level. So that's something that's, I think, potentially good news, potentially bad news, depending on how you think about it. I think it's good news in that they didn't look to dismantle the 8A program entirely, but obviously a step back in terms of priority versus what was occurring under the Trump or the Biden administration. A couple other areas I'll mention. There's been a increasing use of the mentor protege program, and specifically the mentor protege joint venture capabilities by small businesses partnering up with large businesses to increase their past performance capabilities to win spots on many of these large IDIQ contracts. For example, if you look at the VAT4NG contracts, most of the small businesses that won awards under that vehicle were mentor protege joint ventures with an SDV OSB backed by or supported by in partnership with a large business. So I think it's left many small businesses feeling like in order for them to be successful and competitive on some of these contracts, they almost have to have a mentor protege joint venture, at least a joint venture with a larger firm to be competitive. And I don't think that's what the SBA intended when they changed the guidance for agencies to give weight to a joint venture as a combined sort of past performance entity. So they're looking to roll out potential rule changes, like possibly not allowing mentor protege joint ventures to bid on these large IDIQs, or not allowing mentor protege joint ventures to bid on contracts longer than 5 years. So I think we're awaiting the rollout of some potential rule changes that might come into play around the mentor protege joint venture program. The 8A program has, sort of been up and down for many years. It's definitely had some upswing in 2024. I think it decreased a bit post-COVID, but even despite some of the court rulings that are calling into question the nature of the 8A program and how it's worked in the past, there's been pretty strong growth, in particular in 2024, with companies engaging with the 8A program. We'll have to see if that continues, given the change in sort of policies around small disadvantaged business contracting. But overall, pretty strong growth there. And I know we're running up on a little bit of time. I did want to talk about cybersecurity. And while we talk a lot about the possibility of deregulation in some areas, and many of you are probably hoping for deregulation to simplify your contracting engagements, I don't think you can look at cybersecurity as an area where deregulation is likely. In fact, as I mentioned, the appointment of the prior leader of CMMC under the Trump administration, when CMMC was sort of first born, that leader's come back into play. And I think the CMMC program is going into effect this year. And if you are a contractor who is managing and touching controlled unclassified data, you are going to need CMMC and should be investing heavily and quickly to get your capabilities certified so you can be a viable either bidder as a prime or a viable subcontractor to a prime who's going to flow those requirements down to you. It's unfortunately going to be an expensive proposition for you, but I think this is an opportunity for differentiation for those that are serious about the market and those maybe that are just putting their toe in the water. And it's definitely going to favor those that are serious and make the investments in the cybersecurity compliance requirements that the federal government on both the defense and civilian side is going to be demanding of companies that are touching controlled unclassified data across government. And then the last topic I wanted to talk about is sort of some of the dynamics around how the category management and this consolidation of IDIQ contract vehicles is impacting the number of contracting entities. As I mentioned earlier, obviously we've had strong growth in contract spending. You can see that in the blue bar here. I showed you the increase in spending on small businesses and steadily growing in terms of dollars spent. I think the challenge that many of you are facing is that the number of unique prime positions or the number of unique contractors has been on the decline. In fact, I think it's dropped about 35% over the last decade. So pretty significant change in consolidation of the industry. This is, again, driven in part by category management practices and driving people to our agencies to adopt best-in-class contracts. It's driven by the increasing compliance requirements that some small businesses are finding unaffordable or hard to justify for them to be able to support their government work. The advice I give to companies is just be mindful that these compliance requirements are opportunities for differentiation. So I'll wrap up here before we take questions and just encourage you to think of compliance requirements and that cost of doing business as an opportunity to differentiate from small businesses that maybe aren't willing to make that leap. So CMMC, having an approved accounting system to be able to bid on cost plus contracts and be ready for your audits and some of the other business systems requirements. Those are all areas where if you look at some of the IDIQs today, when they put out their Section L and Section M, their evaluation criteria, they're basically giving you upwards of 15 to 20% credit just for your ability to comply with their requirements. From the point of view of the administration transition, look, agency by agency, you need to inventory where you have relationships, where you're aspiring to grow, and be very careful and mindful of the policies that are being rolled out in that organization and figure out how your offerings and capabilities align to those policy priorities. Things like climate change, DEI, we've already seen those quickly hit the chopping blocks. Foreign aid is another area. So if you're finding yourself in some of those areas that are at the crosshairs, you need to very quickly find some other ways or pivot points to shift to some of the other areas that we're seeing in investments, such as defense, unmanned aerial systems, cybersecurity, IT modernization, or to name a few. Obviously, on the DHS side, border security, et cetera. So lots going on. Again, just think about the agency priorities, how your business aligns. If you have contracts, you want to make sure they're in a good place, they're healthy, you have a good relationship with your customer, and make sure it's easy for those career professionals to identify the value of your contract when they're approached by some of the new political appointees that are coming in. So with that, Jessica from our team has offered to run Q&A for us. So Jessica, I'll turn it over to you. I think we got time for 3 or 4 questions.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. That was a great presentation. Thanks for sharing that wealth of knowledge. It was awesome. So it does look like we have a handful of questions for you here in the chat. So the first one, do you have any recommendations for HubZone companies pursuing federal opportunities moving forward, over the next 4 to 8 years?
Yeah, so I think the HubZone program is it's a very unique program. It's, for those of you who don't know, it's the one program that is not based on the ownership of the business. It's based on the location of the employees and the location of the business. So it is truly more of an economic development oriented program versus a program that's designed to help owners of certain business types. And it's also the area that government agencies have had the most trouble complying with in terms of the statutory goals. So first of all, I would say as a HubZone, you have an advantage, and that if you can defend and support your past performance, you have a really good opportunity to be successful, because I think a lot of agencies are looking at how can they increase their HubZone contracting. So making sure that you feature that capability, that you do have that strong past performance. It's a great opportunity for you to find a mentor protege joint venture type of relationship where you can draw on the strengths of another firm to shore you up while you're developing. But I think you're going to find a favorable environment for agencies when you really have a good business case. So making sure responding to RFIs, letting them know you're out there, and that there are hub zones available so that agencies can move forward with things like a hub zone set aside confidently that they historically have shied away from because they're concerned they're not going to get good set of viable competitors.
Perfect. Thanks, Kevin. And I think we have time for one more question here. Do you see any further reductions at other agencies or across other programs, like the Department of Energy with USAID contracts, et cetera, given the new memo about layoffs this morning?
Yeah, so I do think we're going to see an effort. Well, I'll just qualify it this way as an effort to make more reductions. I mean, I say that because there's still a lot of legal battles to be had. I mean, if there's one winner out of the transition, it's the lawyers. There's lots of legal activity happening by unions, by employees, by trade groups, challenging the administration's initiatives. But I do think there's going to be continued efforts to reduce spending. I would look at the last Trump budgets from the prior administration for the tea leaves of where we might see significant agency reductions. It was in the State Department. It was in sort of diplomatic relations. So that area, it was also in the EPA, so climate and environmental issues. Obviously, the Department of Education, well noted in terms of efforts to make that organization go away or significantly diminish it. So yeah, I think civilian agencies that are in the social service area and anything associated to climate, I think are going to be featured targets for the administration. Now, whether they're successful, that's likely going to be determined by courts, but certainly that's where we're going to see the efforts.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. And then just in the interest of time, I am going to hand it back over to National 8A for some closing remarks. If we did not get to your question, we will definitely follow up with you after the webinar concludes. So with that, I'll hand it back to National 8A. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much for today's wonderful webinar. As Jessica mentioned, we are taking all of the questions. We're going to send those over to Deltec, and we will either post those or send those out to the folks that are registered for the event. So no worries if your question didn't get answered. We'll do our best to get to all of them. As a reminder, if you would like to view any of our past webinars, please feel free to do so on our website. We post all of the content there along with materials and slide deck. So this included will be posted at a later day. Once we get the recording downloaded, we'll get that up on our website as well for easy download. But I know we're over time now, so thank you again for everybody that has registered and shown up for the event